about markets, about capitalism, about ethics and morals and how these things go together. So let me ask you this. We talked about efficiency earlier in the year. Does the market create a trade-off between efficiency and decency? We talked about morals and ethics. We talked about what efficiency is. Is there a trade-off between efficiency and decency? Can you become more efficient through the market process at the expense of being a decent person? Let's just get a poll here. Who says yes? Who says no? Interesting. So most said yes. A couple said no. So you had your hand up earlier. Yes.
I think maybe it's not like absolute, but I think if you take like companies like Nike who make a lot of money off like mass producing certain things that are like, trends or that are extremely profitable on the backs of like people who are being like given poor wages to make these things, it's kind of hard to say that that's a decent thing to do in terms of being efficient or making profits.
Okay, so you brought up the fact that Nike and other big organizations, they go into these typically third world countries, these very poor countries. They employ child labor and they pay very low wages by our standards, and they have poor working conditions, etc. So let's talk about that. What is it about the market that creates that incentive? So those of you who thought that the market creates an incentive to be more efficient at the cost of being decent. What is it about the market that does that? Yes?
If you're basically competing against another person who's making the same product and trying to sell to the same consumer, if you can somehow find a way to use the same resources but produce more of that product by taking advantage of other people, you can gain the advantage over your competitor.
Yes?
You're trying to get your price of the product to be as low as possible while the quality is still good.
So you want to get your price to be as low as possible, so you'll do some indecent thing, and that will get your price lower at the cost of decency. Hands up over there, I thought. Yes?
Anytime you see on TV commercials and stuff, they have disclaimers on the bottom of the TV in the white print. You can't really read it, but it's there saying that they're being decent enough to. They warned you, but of course nobody can actually read it.
Okay. So the fine print that nobody can read is too fine. That's interesting. So let's talk about this this issue about people in these sweatshops, as they're known, right? Let's talk about the sweatshop issue. Is the problem with the sweatshop the fact that the wages are low? Is that the problem with the sweatshop? What makes sweatshops indecent? Yes?
The working conditions.
The working conditions. They're unsafe, would you say?
Yeah.
What else would you say about the working conditions that makes sweatshops indecent?
Like the hours are really long, and a lot of people in one place, and there's not proper ventilation.
Right. So there's poor ventilation, long hours, etc. We talked about exchange on Monday, and part of exchange in a market is that if it's voluntary exchange, then both parties are better off. You remember that from Monday? If both parties are better off in an exchange, who are we to say, to judge, that the exchange is actually making one person worse off? So let's talk about the sweatshop issue. There's an economist by the name of Benjamin Powell. He studies sweatshops extensively. He's visited sweatshops and he's talked to the people working in those under those conditions. And he's asked them, what would you prefer? Would you prefer working at the current wage that you're getting now, or a lower wage, but slightly more safe conditions, more exits, more other things? Because you have to remember, safety comes at a cost, right? To build safer equipment, you have to take more precautions. You got to invest more resources. Safety always comes at a cost. there's always an opportunity to be more safe. Perfect safety is impossible. Porsche, the car company Porsche is famous for, well, let me clarify, that safety doesn't always mean cheaper either, or more expensive either. Porsche, the car company, is famous for removing weight from its cars at a higher price so that the cars go faster, which is what its customers want. They want faster, less safe cars. And the workers in these sweatshops, according to Benjamin Powell, they want the higher wages and they're willing to take the added risks of working. Let's talk about another issue. Advertising. A lot of people don't like advertising. They say it's crass, they say it's rude, they say it's vulgar. Remember our diagram from Monday, when we talked about the production process, where consumers dictate what producers make, what they do with their resources. Advertising, when would you advertise? Would you advertise if you're the only product available and everybody knows about you? Or would you advertise when people have options? Right? Advertising is only necessary in rich societies. Advertising is a problem, so long as it is a problem, of being rich, of being affluent. If you're living in poverty, there's no point to advertising. So that's the first thing you should notice. Advertising is only viable in rich societies. And then what do you advertise? Why do you advertise? Is to differentiate your product from others. To give people a reason to buy your product instead of the competitors. Even grains. What's more homogeneous than grains? Even those grain producers have incentives to advertise. You've heard about the distinction between buy local versus global. That's a kind of advertising. People say, oh, support your local egg farmers. It's because you have options of buying eggs from afar. Now, some advertising, people say it's vulgar. Well, whose problem is that? Advertising has scantily clad models and other things. What are the producers trying to do with their advertisers? They're trying to entice you to buy. They can't make you like something. The reason advertising to you feels crass is because to other people it's effective. A producer would only advertise in a certain way if he thinks that by advertising in that way, it's going to be increase the demand for his product. And we talked also on Monday that not all advertising is equally effective. New Coke famously spent a lot of money on advertising, and they failed. So advertising companies only advertise when they think they're going to be successful at it. And if you don't like what the advertising looks like, then the advertising isn't for you. And if enough people feel the same way as you do, then the company will lose money doing that, and they will have to change their tune. People typically who dislike these sorts of displays, these aesthetic displays, they say, oh, there's some sort of higher standard, right? They hold their nose up, they're snobbish people. They say, oh, we can do better. We can do better. Well, what is better? Preferences are subjective. The people who think they can do better think that everyone will agree what better is. But even among the expert tastemakers of our society, there exists huge variance of taste, of preferences, of what is good and bad. And people who want higher standards always think that their standards are of the highest quality. They can't even imagine that it's possible others will view that their standards are lowly and vulgar and crass. Tastes are subjective. We talked about safety. We talked about crass advertising. Let's talk about commodification. Does paying for things, is that inherently indecent? How many of you own a pet, cat or dog? Keep your hands up if you paid for your cat or dog. And do you remember, who remembers how much they paid for their cat? How much?
I think it was about $75.
$75. Have you taken your animals, your pets, to a vet?
Yes.
Yes. And what was your typical vet visit cost? More than $75 or
Yes.
less? More than $75. Why didn't you just buy new pets? Right? Why didn't you just buy new pets? Commodification, you're paying money for this. Why would you spend more money on fixing your broken pet than buying a new one? Why? Let's relax. Why didn't you just buy new pets? Would you say you love them?
Yes.
Yeah? Would you say the fact that you pay for them detracts from the fact that you love them and you care for them and compassionate for them? Yeah. Just because you pay for something doesn't mean that you can't love it, that you can't value it personally, that you can't view it as a member of your family, like many people claim that they view their pets as. Right? Any questions so far? No. What other objections to markets can you think of? What about greed? Markets make people greedy. Right? Well, what is greed? You and I aren't greedy. It's always the other guy, right? Yeah. It's always the other guy who's greedy. Well, if greed is taking more than you're entitled to, remember our definition of justice is getting what you're due? Greed then is taking what belongs not to you but to someone else. That's injustice. My proposal today is that markets are ethically neutral. They are ethically neutral. As long, whatever sort of ethic you believe, whatever sort of ethics the society has, markets will just do the most efficient thing of bringing about those ethical conclusions. If you see an outcome, a market outcome that you don't like, the problem isn't the market. The problem is some other ethical notion that's taken over society. Let's talk about those possible ethical notions. So, in economics, we deal with scarcity, and the scarcity is when you have to make exchanges. And another thing about scarcity is that it produces conflict, or the potential for conflict, right? There's one of these Nalgene water bottles. There's two of us. Who owns it? Only one of us can use it at the same time. So we need some sort of decision rule about who can use it. We call these decision rules rights, right? And these scarce objects over these, that we have these decision rules about, we call them property. That's property, it's a physical thing, and then we have rights over this property. So to avoid conflict, we have rules to avoid conflict. Property rights are to avoid conflict, to deal with conflict issues. And today, we're going to be talking about 5 different theories of property property rights. Well, first of all, what's a theory? What is a theory? Who knows what a theory is? You're all in environmental science. You talk about theories all the time, right? Yes. A hypothesized school of thought. Okay. Anyone else? An idea for a theory? What is a theory? Yes.
A proposed and widely accepted set of like rules or statements about how a system works.
A widely accepted set of rules or statements about how a system works. That's a common understanding. Anybody else have a different understanding of theory, the word theory? So I'm going to tell you today that a theory is an explanation of some phenomenon. It's an explanation of some phenomenon. So the theory of gravity is an explanation of gravity. You take gravity, you point to gravity, say, this is gravity, right? This is gravity. What's the explanation for why does my pen fall down? And then you have a theory of gravity. Newton had his own theory of gravity. Einstein had a different theory of gravity. Yes?
I was just going to say, in addition to that, it's also something that can be tested. So you can test that theory of gravity.
You can test the theory of gravity. So I would call that a theory of science. Can I test that theory of science?
You can.
How can I test the theory that you can test theories of science?
By, like, when you have a scientific method to put it to work.
So a scientific method, most people think of falsification, right? Can I falsify something? So the statement is, or the theory is, all scientific statements are falsifiable. How do you falsify that statement? The answer is you can't. You can't. So you got to be careful what you consider science. There's a whole theory of science. And that theory isn't falsifiable. So we have theories of property rights. So the point is that property rights exist. How do we explain them? There are at least 5 different ways. There are probably many more. But here are probably the most common ways. So probably the most popular is called utilitarianism. Who's heard of utilitarianism? Who can explain what utilitarianism is? Any hands? Yes?
When you're making decisions on which actions to take, it's states that you should act in a manner that maximizes the outcome.
Yeah, that's generally it, but more common explanation is the greatest good for the greatest number. That's utilitarian. Utility is good, happiness, whatever. It's the greatest good for the greatest number. Yes?
Same greatest number in reference to people.
Yeah.
Not.
No, yeah. So it's reference to people. Well, some utilitarians think that in addition to people, we should also take into account the feelings of animals. Right? So the greatest good for the greatest number, the number has to include people and animals. And so those people tend to argue for veganism or some other animal welfare arguments. Moving on, we've got something called, I'm going to classify this as classical liberalism. Classical liberalism. So today when you hear the word liberalism or liberal, it has some meanings to you. Classical liberalism refers to a specific period of history, about the 1800s, sometimes going back earlier. For example, John Locke is most associated with classical liberals, and he was, I think, in the mid-1600s. But the idea with classical liberalism is that there is a government, there should be a government, and the purpose of the government is to protect individual property rights. Okay? So right now we have a big government that can do many sorts of things. It has It has welfare programs, it has, I don't know, cultural preservation programs, etc. Classical liberals believe in something called a minimalist government. Its only job is to defend private property. And they say you come to attain private property by, it's called, so you can either exchange for it voluntarily, you can gift it to someone, or homestead unowned property. And homesteading means slightly different things to different people, but generally you come across some unowned properties, say land, and you mix your labor with the land. Or you mix your labor with the unknown property, and you come to own it that way. And then you own that property, and then you can exchange it, or gift it, or mix other sorts of properties to make new property. You can have your own metal, and your own rubber, and your own wood, and you put it together to make a pencil. And the government's job is only to preserve those rights. So that's courts, that's police, that's also the army. That's classical liberalism. We now got something called pragmatism. Pragmatism is sort of like utilitarianism. Pragmatism believes that there's no such thing as a general rule, accepts the statement there is no such thing as a general rule. Right? So they will make decisions on a case-by-case basis, whatever is popular at the time, whatever is convenient at the time. That's pragmatism. If you got questions about any of this, feel free to jump in. Next we got legal positivism. Legal positivism. Legal positivists believe that rules, the law, property, is whatever the state says it is. That's it. End of argument. State says it, I believe it, that settles it. That's legal positivism. Finally, we have libertarianism. Libertarianism is similar to classical liberalism, but they take that argument even further. They say, the classical liberals said, we need the government to protect private property rights with police and courts and an army. Libertarianism says, we don't even need the government to do that. We can have our own private courts, our own private police, and our own private armies. We can do this through the same method of private property, appropriation and exchange, and gifting, etc., investments. We can also apply these principles to providing security, to providing dispute settlements, etc. That's libertarianism. Yes?
Sorry, but you were saying that it's kind of saying that you don't need the government, we can do it all ourselves.
Yes. So, any other questions before moving on? Yes?
For legal positivism, doesn't everyone have to somewhat believe in that? Like, is not what we have right now?
So right now, if the government passes a law that says no more Muslim immigrants, which is what the American government tried to do, there are ways of counteracting that. So there was a period of Chinese history where they believed in legal positivism, or that was their expected belief, and then there were complications. Yes?
So that example that you gave is an example of legal positivism?
That was an attempt at legal positivism.
Okay, okay.
And then there were other countervailing measures, yes.
Okay, but because they were able to kind of push it back.
Because we don't live in a legal positive society. Any other clarifications? Yes.
Just again, clarification, communism, all property stuff, where does that fit into like the framework of houses?
So communism, let's go back from one step. So there's socialism and there's communism. People make a distinction between them. Socialism is the public or social or government ownership of production, of the means of production. Communism is the belief that this is some sort of necessary, natural, historical progression of society. That we're necessarily going to come to this state of nature where we have everything is owned by everyone simultaneously. Okay? Communists also believe in a theory of property rights, except instead of whereas we have classical liberals and libertarians saying individuals own property and then they can, with contract, exchange property, have joint property, etc. Socialism and communism think that there's some sort of collective organization that can own property, but that overrides individual preferences. Is that clear? On that topic, let's go back to the ethics of the market. We have the market, which is private ownership of the means of production, which is exchange of rights, of property. The people who bring up these objections against the market, they talk about the commodification, they talk about the greed and all these other things. When they always bring up these examples, their solution is always some sort of central coordination, right? Even when it comes to taste. So they want national standards for advertising. And that's taking away private property rights for advertising. When you go see a billboard, and you don't like that billboard, whose problem is that? You don't like it, but where are you looking at the billboard? You're looking at the billboard from probably some publicly owned road, government-owned road, and the billboard is on some private land, and it's owned by a private corporation. Where do you come into that equation? So you can say that you have paid taxes to use that road. Fair enough. Does that take away the right of the landowner from using their own land to erect a billboard? Not necessarily, but you can use one of these ideas, right? You can say pragmatically they shouldn't have that right to do it. Or you can make a utilitarian argument. More people would be happy if they didn't see that advertisement. But this is all an infringement on the individual property owner. This is all an attempt to centralize, take away rights from the individual and give it to someone else. Let's talk about something else. Zoning. What is zoning? So you have some land, and then you want to turn that land into a high-rise apartment. Zoning tells you that you can't. You can only turn that land into some two-story building that houses only one family or at most two families. You can't have a high-rise apartment that has 10 or 12 or 50 families. That's zoning. That's the government telling people what they can do with their property, and people justify it for different reasons. People justify it by saying, oh, if we do this, then people will build factories next to daycares, and that's going to create pollution or those other negative effects. That's utilitarianism. People say pragmatically it's difficult, because if you do have these, a factory next to a daycare, we have an economic theory of this, by the way. If a factory is next to a daycare or dentist, we'll talk about this later in the semester. But it's possible that one person can buy the rights of the other. And then people can say pragmatically that's not possible, so we'll just put a blanket rule that no one's allowed to do that. When you do have a situation of transition from private property to government property, this is called expropriation. It's when the government takes private property and often, but not always, compensates the owner somehow. They do this through eminent domain, typically. Eminent domain is the right of the government to take private property and use it for the public interest. And they will do this to build highways. There was a famous case in the US, though, where the government took a woman's property in order for another private developer to build a mall on her property, with the argument being that the mall is going to generate more tax revenue than the little old lady's house. And the government used that justification to take property. How do you justify the government taking your property? Comes down to your theory of property rights. So these are, by the way, theories of property rights. These are explanations. Which of these is best? That comes down to ethics of property rights. Which is most ethical is different than which theory of what property rights are. What they should be, what they ought to be, that's ethics. Explaining them is theory. Any other questions? What about regulation of, I don't know, the environment, right? So carbon taxes. A lot of people favor carbon taxes. What do carbon taxes do? Is that they regulate how much carbon you're allowed to emit. They price it, really they tax it by the ton. When they tax it by the ton, that means you can't use your own property in some sort of preconceived manner. Why does the government get the right to do that? Well, it could be for pragmatic reasons. It could be for utilitarian reasons. It could be for legally positivistic reasons. It could possibly be for classical liberal reasons. That's safety, right? It definitely won't be for libertarian reasons. Let's end the conversation with talking about intellectual property rights. Intellectual property rights. Who knows what intellectual property is? Intellectual property are property rights that the state, through legislation, creates for inventions of the mind. So that's inventions, that's artistic works. So inventions are covered by patents. Artistic works are covered by copyrights. And you can have like logos and branding, that's covered by trademarks. And then there are several other classifications, but those are the big three: patents, copyrights, trademarks. Patent means somebody has a patent for a wooden-looking water bottle. I can't, with a patent like that, that means I can't buy my own wood and my own press machine and my own other factors of production to make my own water bottle that looks like that and sell it. I bought all these things individually myself, but because it looks like something else or functions like something else that a patent exists for, I don't have the right to sell it. Copyright is somebody writes a song or somebody draws a cartoon mouse, and then I can't sing that song without getting permission from the original artist. Or I can't redraw that animation without the original artist's permission. With patent and copyrights, people talk about intellectual property theft. They talk about theft. But with patent and copyrights, what we're doing is dealing with this copying, right? And copying isn't theft. When I steal this water bottle, I have it, he doesn't. When I copy his water bottle, he has his water bottle, I have my water bottle. We both have water bottles. But the problem is that if he's trying to sell his water bottle, he now has to compete with me, so now he faces more competition. So people make pragmatic or utilitarian arguments for restricting competition to preserve his right to profit, alleged right to profit. With trademarks, people make the case that trademarks are protecting consumers against fraud. But when you buy knockoff Louis Vuitton, Louis Vuitton typically sells for thousands of dollars. And you see some guy on the corner of the street selling you what looks like, or what he claims is Louis Vuitton for $20. No one in the world believes that's an original Louis Vuitton. So you're not being defrauded that way. If somebody does sell you what looks like a Rolex and is priced similar to a Rolex, but you come home and you find out later that the jewels are fake, it's not a real Rolex, you were defrauded, yes? So then you can go sue the person who committed fraud against you. What role does the original Rolex manufacturer have in this? Trademark says that the original Rolex manufacturer can come to anyone they think is infringing their trademark, and whether it's an obvious fake or not, they can say that you have to stop and you're infringing their trademark. And with that, we'll see you on Friday. Thank you.